finished a chapter for a book called Justice on the Ark about sanctuaries and about the challenges, the comparing and the contrasting of zoos and sanctuaries, accredited zoos and sanctuaries. There are some extraordinary sanctuaries in this country, and you just mentioned one of them, the sanctuary in California, which is where we sent our elephants. And our regrets were just that, we did this, 12, 13 years ago, 14 years ago, whatever. Who said we didn't do it sooner? And I'm sure that when we finish with sending birds and others that we don't think are appropriate for our climate or situation, I'm sure we'll say we wish we'd done it sooner. But the reality is that most sanctuaries don't have the expertise or the conditions, either the physical conditions or the resources that most accredited zoos have. That doesn't mean that they're inferior, it just means that they actually aren't a better solution. Now, I'm not arguing that about elephants, and certainly when we sent ours, at that point in time, there were not zoos that had, in our view, conditions that were as good as the ones at the elephant sanctuary. But I think perhaps the more important issue is what would it mean for zoos to actually be real sanctuaries? And that would mean that there'd be incredibly limited breeding, that it wouldn't be breeding for, I can't remember the word Delcianna used, but it wouldn't be for the supply chain. It would be breeding for legitimate reasons of conservation, and that's primarily things like amphibians and the smaller animals that ultimately can be released into the wild. And that you really are starting out with the individual first, not the population first. It's important, I think, for your audience to understand that conservation is incredibly important. Conservation is the welfare of species. It has nothing to do with the welfare of an individual. And there's this emerging field of compassionate conservation, which we happen to subscribe to, which basically says you really have to think carefully about unintended consequences, because a lot of the big conservation projects that everybody rejoices about are great for one species and they're horrible for something else. I think of the black-footed ferret that's been released into the wild. I can tell you that all of the prairie dogs that are in that area are not happy that all of a sudden there's a predator in town. So the conservation stuff's really important, but it is about the welfare of a species. It's Darwinian, it's blind to the individual. And what we're focused on is how to get the balance right of doing what is fantastic for individual animals and contributing to conservation. And it's tough. It's a very tough, and there's a lot of intrinsic tension to that.
And I guess you also up against non-United States interests. So, for example, there's now a new breeding facility for orcas in China, and China is developing the Orlando of China. So we're kind of exporting SeaWorld to China. So you not only have the struggle in the United States, but now you've got countries that don't have federal animal welfare statutes, and they're copying the model that we're trying to move away from. Anybody want to just comment on orcas before we, and China, the future of where we're going with that? I mean, James, I know you're a marine mammal focus, and you've worked with the ACA and interests on marine mammals. You want to comment on orcas?
I think you've just said it, that's the evolving frontier. And unlike the SeaWorld parks in recent decades, the Chinese effort by the Chinese parks, as I understand it, has been fueled by collections from Russia.
Right, those orcas have come from Russia
Yeah.
so far. But the Marine Mammal Protection Act here was changed in 1994 that would allow SeaWorld, if it wanted to, as I understand it, to sell their orcas if they wanted to China, which before 1994 they couldn't. But I think the orcas today in China have come from Russia.
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the pre-94 Marine Mammal Protection Act export.
Yeah, they would still need an export
Yeah.
permit,
They would
even
still
with
need-
the amendments, but it would not be difficult to obtain.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it changed the parameters where, and Delcy, you may know this, the 94 reauthorization of the Marine Mammal Protection Act dropped the requirement that there be a permit for the export. There still is an export authorization needed, and you need CITES permission, but there's a different regulatory framework for exports, whereas marine mammal imports require a notice and comment permit, notice and comment in the Federal Register, and an open permit process.
Let me put this together both for China. You know, there are a bunch, I think there are 6 or 7 of us within AZA that are running a gorilla orphanage in the Congo. It is beyond explicit that no gorillas will come out of there for captivity, and in fact what we're doing is fighting the Chinese to make sure, because there's constant threats and efforts to extract animals out of the wild. So, you know, there is ample room for criticism of zoos and even specifically of AZA, but it's very important for people to understand that we are doing a lot of things that you will not know about because it has nothing to do with exhibition of animals that is no one else is doing and no one else can do. So I just, you know, I feel like it's important not to leave this with an imbalanced kind of opinion.
We also have federal laws that a lot of other countries don't have, so we're ahead there as well.
But on the subject of not leaving with an unbalanced opinion, things are changing very rapidly in China in terms of development of what we might think of as middle-class values with respect to the environment and with respect to animals. And in some areas, there's just been enormous change in a relatively short period of time. And I personally always a bit wince when we turn from talking about our problems and our abuses to the idea that they're worse or going to be worse somewhere else. One way that I personally believe in putting America first is in addressing our problems first.
Okay, do we have a methodology here for Q&A? Were we going to do the index cards or?
I think you can just take
Okay.
a couple questions. It's not just that time.
Okay. This third row here?
Thank you so much, all of you. It's incredibly informative and disheartening. In full disclosure, I'm an organizational change professional, so I really loved your presentation, Jim. But I have so much to say. I'm not sure I know how to formulate
Just a
the
question, because we're almost out of time.
I am also an activist who want to focus on action, and I was struck by Ms. Winder's comment earlier about inspectors and the fact that they are so overwhelmed. We are facing in this country a huge baby boom retirement issue.
Please ask your question.
I am asking my question. Thank you so much. So this is an untapped resource. These are individuals who are compassionate about animals. We should focus on training and development. So individuals are citizens of this country who may be looking for opportunities to tap into their expertise and skills can become inspector advisors or get trained about this, so they also can be enforcers, and we can get the media alerted to this. In addition, by the way, I don't know if you folks know about a new TV series called The Zoo, which to me is very educational. I wish it was shown at an earlier time, but I think that's also informative to understand about the responsibility of zoos and what we can do and what zoos are doing. So that was a recommendation. I would like to be involved in some training and development of this untapped resource.
Okay, we had a question over here on the left? Yeah.
There was a question, how
Oh.
do you do that? That's the
Oh,
question.
how do you, I
Sorry.
didn't hear the question. Well, they have to get on the payroll of somebody.
No, this is a volunteer, these are retirees who are looking to use their talent and expertise.
I'm talking about
How do you get them
USDA
trained and
inspectors.
developed? They don't
Yes.
necessarily need a pay stub. Is it viable? Can we use them as a resource?
If they're willing to volunteer, I mean, I think it would be great if they went out and monitored facilities and documented to make up for the paucity of inspectors and inspections. So there's definitely roles for volunteers like that to help, especially if they can develop some
Who
level
would
of
sponsor
expertise.
them? Who would supervise them, sponsor them?
I mean, they can, that's a huge discussion.
Okay,
So, yeah.
okay. Question? Yeah.
This is directed a little bit to Ron. I think that the court of public opinion, it would be an amazing workforce for animal safety in zoos. And I think that there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who love animals, and their caring for the cute little animals can be channeled to dealing with the things that Delcy deals with legislation and getting change done. Also, if people don't go to zoos, they don't make money. The people who run zoos don't like that. So in terms of calling for boycotts, in terms of mobilizing the hundreds of thousands of people in the country that care about animals, my question is there an organization that could spearhead all of, that could do social media, that could, you know, under the umbrella, get everybody going? Because I think that this is a change that could happen, because there's so much public opinion for it. And when I say this change, I mean animal welfare, better animal welfare in zoos.
Well, you know, I encourage everybody, kind of like Delcy, that if people care about stuff, they should be active. And so when Mark Bekoff about 15 years ago called me an activist, I think he thought that I was going to feel insulted, and I didn't. I think there are plenty of avenues. We have, at our institution, we have 1,100 people who volunteer. Those people are interacting with 1.7 million visitors a year, telling them about the issues that we think are important, which, you know, primarily revolve around animal welfare, and it gets them involved. It gets them involved politically. Obviously, organizations like HSUS and PETA have enormous following, and those people as well. We have 260,000 Facebook fans. Those people all follow the kinds of issues, and we talk about all these issues. So I think there are plenty of ways to get involved, and I encourage people to get involved. And you know, we always say what I think Mikki started out saying in the very beginning: do things respectfully. The nice thing is that we have proven something that maybe got lost in the discussion of the elephants. We heard from a lot of people, including local people, including colleagues, that by sending the elephants away, that people would not come to the zoo. And we had a belief that was not right, that people would understand ultimately, especially if we explained the situation. So this is going back 12 years. We had 1 million visitors a year. We now have 1.7 million. So the arguments about not doing the right thing, or the arguments that in order to be a great zoo, you have to have elephants and tigers and lions and, you know, the whole menagerie thing, it's a lot of baloney. What people want, and frankly what the animals want, is a great quality of life and a great experience. And it has nothing to do with whether it's 1,000 animals or 10,000 animals.
No. Okay, well, we're at 8:30, so, you know, let's just see if we can sneak in 2 questions. We started 10 minutes late. Yes.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I just wanted to say thank you for doing this. I've worked for Friends of Animals, so this is near and dear to us because we filed a lawsuit in terms with the Swaziland elephant case. And I've been writing a lot about this, and what I found frustrating is that there's this assertion that zoos are non-commercial, have non-commercial activities in their education and conservation organizations. But then, in terms of conservation, you can call them just a conservation organization, but they might be, just reintroducing, like he said, amphibians somewhere, which is also meaningful, but are they holding themselves to the gold standards of conservation, which is reintroducing species into their native, habitat, or preventing human-wildlife conflict in the native habitat? So, for instance, African elephants in Africa. Do any of you know of any zoos that are actually doing those two things in terms of reintroducing elephants into their native habitats or helping with on-the-ground human-wildlife conflict in Africa?
Well, let me just quickly say something. I just came back from Nepal. We're helping the Nepalese with human-wildlife conflict and snow leopards. So I was there. We were investing a lot of money to help the local people. The challenge is simple. There are a lot of hunters there that are killing the blue sheep, the wild blue sheep, and that's the normal prey of the snow leopards. And so the snow leopards then come into villages and prey on the livestock that people have. And we're helping those people with some fairly simple solutions like guard dogs. I want to just clarify on reintroduction. It is not as simple as saying, well, let's just put elephants back in the wild. I've had this conversation with Jane Goodall about reintroducing chimps back into Africa. She said that would be horrible. It would be a terrible mistake. I don't think, I think you have to be really careful about which species can safely be reintroduced because the environment actually is protected. And so when we reintroduce, whether it's amphibians or anything else, there are a lot of birds we introduce into various places. It's always after even the snails back into Tahiti. It's always places that we know are safe. And there unfortunately aren't a lot of safe wild places, but there are some.
No, I'm a bit confused because I've always understood the introduction to be returning a species to a place where it no longer exists. So if you're talking about reintroduction of elephants, that would mean returning them to places that they no longer exist, at least as I understand the concept.
I just meant contributing money to like an on-the-ground group in Africa that's actually helping like orphaned elephants or something.
Well,
That's what I mean.
I'm not an authority on this. Perhaps there's somebody here in the room who is. I think the Wildlife Conservation Society probably is very actively engaged in some of those things.
So the problem is there are some zoos that do a lot in various dimensions of these issues, and there are many zoos that do very little with most of these issues. The bigger problem is that we talk about, and this builds on what Ron was saying, we talk about conservation as if we know what that means. And we don't at this point in human history. So when you talk, if you think about what is actually happening in this world, the human domination of nature continues to grow. Almost exponentially, decade by decade. So the whole idea of introducing animals into nature when nature is still collapsing because of human impacts may not actually make a lot of sense generally. It may make a little sense for a few species, but not for most. So what conservation might actually mean in this world is radically reducing consumption at home rather than reintroduction. But those are all the issues that need to be discussed and debated, and mostly we go on, I think, talking about these things as if we know what we're talking about, when the more fundamental question is we don't.
Lance, I think you had a question from way back, right?
Yeah.
So let's just, please ask the question. Okay, don't make a statement, please just ask the question.
Regarding
We're really out of
accountability,
time.
I know Ron spoke a little bit about, the medical profession, about how there's X number of medical malpractices each year. Now, those institutions are fined millions and millions of dollars. Now, what you're referring to before, $1,000, $2,000 fine is really not going to incentivize the zoo, which ultimately is a financial entity. How can we get that number up to a substantive level where it's really going to encourage zoos to really take the next step, even though, errors are not always preventable, but, you get hit with a $100,000, $200 fine, and that's really going to make a substantive change.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the penalty guidelines that the USDA is using, and first and foremost, those need to be made transparent and available to the public, because the OIG for decades has said these guidelines aren't working, USDA goes in and fiddles with them, they come out worse over and over again. So until they're transparent, it's really hard to even know where to begin, but you can certainly develop workable guidelines for penalty escalation when people continue to violate the law. And not renewing licenses is huge, and there are also criminal penalties available under the Animal Welfare Act. If someone disregards after being assessed monetary penalties, in certain cases, criminal penalties may be appropriate, and right now they're virtually never pursued.
Last question? Okay, we'll do one more? One more last question.
Yeah, I mean, this is mostly for Delcy. In terms of legislation, I'm wondering how far local jurisdictions can and can't go in regulating zoos themselves, and if that's preempted by UWA.
It is absolutely not preempted by the Animal Welfare Act. The Animal Welfare Act clearly states that it's not intended to preclude higher state or local standards. So there is a tremendous amount that states and localities can do. And in terms of animal protection efforts overall, local legislation is where I've seen the most development in the past few years. So I think there's definitely more potential in the zoo arena there.
Okay, I think we've got to wrap it up.